Incorporation is important. It is vital because it allows you to do certain things. You will only be recognized at the point of incorporation. Your birth is only going to begin at the point of incorporation. Whether you are in Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, or even if you have dreams of setting up your company in the US, your intention is to form a separate legal entity that is going to give you certain powers and obligations. An investor is not going to give you money as a founder without having any legal personality. Just as Solomon had his birth on Monday, as a founder, your birth is going to be crystallized by having incorporation and being a going concern. Incorporation gives you the right to own a name, it gives you the right to belong, and it gives you a heartbeat. On Monday, Solomon was born. For founders, birth does not begin with an idea, but with a formal act of incorporation. Imagine that you're an African founder in Nairobi, eating your nyama choma with friends, contemplating the new unicorn that's going to rock the entire continent. Or you're chilling with your friends in Joburg, eating your bride, doing the same. Or on the streets of Lagos, eating your jollof. All this is important because it allows you to formalize and really understand the idea that you are beginning to work on as founders. But the brutal and honest truth is that you will only be recognized at the point of incorporation. Your birth is only going to begin at the point of incorporation. Why is this important? Incorporation allows you to do different things. It allows you to raise capital. It allows you to sue and be sued. It allows you to have a separate legal personality. It allows you to be able to also get into contractual obligations. The problem we have is that sometimes as founders, we tend to operate with our foot to the pedal, trying to actualize our idea, sometimes forgetting the other things that truly matter. And so today we'll be trying to forge the foundation that is going to guarantee your success in the same way that Simon Makonde was doing and is going to do in the journey that you're going to go on together. Monday is more than just paperwork. It's a day your startup is born in the eyes of the lawman, the taxman, your employees, your investors, as well as the world. And so today we are going to be discussing three very important things: incorporation, opening up a bank account, and establishing a tax identification number. And so incorporation is a line between wishful thinking and world-changing execution. So welcome to Lawtus, Legal for Founders. I'm your host, Keega Gakuua, the managing partner of Keega and Company Advocates, as well as the head of Legal at Site Limited. Welcome to Monday. So in the grand scheme of things, choosing the legal structure that you're going to adopt is very important. Whether you are in Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, or even if you have dreams of setting up your company in the US. The reason why this is the case is because it's going to cement your presence in a particular territory or within a particular region. And if you are a diligent founder, your obligation is to ensure that from the very onset, you've set the perfect foundation for your startup to grow, mature, and thrive. And so in this respect, incorporation today, we are going to look at it in different lenses. The first lens is understanding that there is powers that be, so to speak, in terms of how startups have operated, both in the past as well as now. What I mean by that is that there are some jurisdictions that have had a more robust framework, and therefore they've been able to create the background and the history and the structure of how these structures operate to date. For that reason, even as an African founder, there are some considerations that you'll have to make depending on the nature of your business. Do I incorporate just in my country? Do I do the same regionally? Is there a need for me to register my company in Delaware in the US, for that matter? These are the questions that all of us typically have. And so in that respect, I'm going to first back up for us to understand a few concepts so that all this can make sense. When you're looking at shares is the unit of ownership in a company. When you're looking at it from the common stock perspective. Generally, there's what is referred to as common stock, and the flip side is that you'll also have another class of shares referred to as preference shares. Common stock is an actual unit of ownership in a company. And what you'll typically find is that these common shares are going to have some certain characteristics. One is that typically they'll be owned by the founders, the employees, and the initial investors. These days, you find angel investors demanding that they get preference shares as opposed to common shares. And on the flip side, when you're looking at preference shares, they're typically going to be owned by institutional investors, such as VCs and private equity. And so the reason why this is important is because it's going to help you understand why incorporation is important and how you can be able to protect your interests as a founder. And so when you're looking at the formation of a company, typically you're going to want to have different classes of shares to give you certain rights, obligations, and duties. When you're looking at common shares, typically, as I said before, they're going to be owned by the founders, the initial team, the employees, and initial investors. And the reason why this is often the case is that you are often exchanging your time, your IP, and your resources in terms of trying to make your idea get to become a minimum viable product, and then it transcends to product market fit, and then finally you can be able to get to the price rounds that we talked about in the previous episode. And so in this respect, the common shares and the preference shares is the foundation of how you should look at equity and you should look at ownership within a company. And so when you're looking at common shares, they're typically going to have one vote for one share, and they're typically going to have rights that are not going to be commensurate to those of preference shares. For example, you will find that for common shares, you will not have a liquidation preference. What I mean by that is, in the event that your company is liquidated, as a common stockholder, you're going to be compensated last. When you look on the flip side, for preference shares, you're going to have priority rights in terms of how they obtain certain things. One, for example, dividends from the company, where they have what is referred to as cumulative shares, meaning that if they're not paid in this year, they could cumulate to the other year. And they might also have other rights that would allow them to also have certain powers in terms of disclosure, in terms of how the company is going to be managed and run. And the intention of having such shares is to ensure that institutional players can be able to guarantee their return on investment. So that is the background, that is the beginning. From that understanding, then we move on to incorporation generally, where your intention is to form a separate legal entity that is going to give you certain powers and obligations. And so incorporation is important. It is vital because it allows you to do certain things. One, it allows you to raise money. An investor is not going to give you money as a founder without having any legal personality. Secondly, is that it allows you to have separate legal personality. What this means is that the debts of the company are not going to be assigned or ascribed to you. In a case where you don't have a company, any risk that you have as a founder would have the effect of that becoming a personal liability rather than a company liability. And so in that respect, it's often important to have something that can be able to guard you as a founder to protect some of the issues that would arise otherwise. The third reason why this is important is that it allows you to own property. It allows you to own both real property in terms of assets such as vehicles, actual land. It also allows you to own intellectual property. The other important aspect of incorporation is that it also allows you to protect your brand and its property. So what I mean by that is with provisions such as trademarks, NDAs, IP assignment agreements, and some of these provisions that we're going to talk about later in the episode. And so in the grand scheme of things, the important thing to note here is that incorporation is meant to be, one, a birth certificate that allows you to receive legal formality and legal recognition. So without incorporation, your startup is vulnerable, unofficial, and you run the risk of having your IP stolen, you run the risk of investors shying away from you, and you run the risk of having personal debts for things that you've done in the pursuit of your startup. So in that respect, it's important for you to look at incorporation very seriously. Before, I'd mentioned that it's important for you to look at what your particular circumstances are as a founder. And so a lot of people will want to incorporate in Delaware, specifically in the US, because there are some certain advantages that exist. The advantages in the past have been that most startups are typically going to be formed there, meaning that there's a very huge incentive for founders to incorporate there because the investors are there. They've had a very robust code system that is able to support such startups. They've also been able to have a very robust legal system that is able to provide the rule of law that is often required to promote business. And so things like IPOs in territories like Delaware are going to proceed very fast. On the flip side, there are also some certain disadvantages of having your company in Delaware. And for an African founder, it might not be necessary. And so some of the qualifications that you can look at to determine whether you might need to incorporate in the US or in other territories or not is by looking at the dynamics of your business. And so one, if you intend to have institutional investors from the US or from other countries that are not located in Africa, then it might be easier for you to have a company that is domiciled in the US. In a similar vein, if you intend to own your property, or rather the IP that you own is going to have a regional footprint, it is often easier to have the holding company in the US that can be able to ensure that all the assets of the company are held in trust and well, while you have other operating companies in the regions that you want to actually have a foothold in, assuming all the risk. And so when you're looking at it from multiple perspectives, there's an advantage to having a company in Delaware and in the US. But as I said, there have been issues in the past where we've had companies leaving. In fact, it was so bad, it was being referred to as Dexit. Dexit happened a few years ago, and it started with Tesla. The reason why this was the case was because Elon Musk was meant to be assigned some certain shares. And despite the shareholders and the board wanting this to be the case, the court refused. And this really angered the entire startup ecosystem, because one of the things that we really valued about Delaware and the US was the autonomy of businesses to be able to make their own decisions in the way that they deem fit. And so in that respect, it has led to a cascade effect where a lot of companies have left. Dropbox has left, TripAdvisor has left, Coinbase recently left, and of course Tesla. This is not to mean that Delaware is not a good jurisdiction, but it just points to the fact that maybe there might be some issues in terms of the ability to be able to attract talent in the way that they did in the past. And so what we've had are people choosing other jurisdictions within the US, such as Nevada, Texas, and Wyoming, that have been able to really ensure that startup founders, their boards, and investors have the ability to make decisions in the way that they deem fit. Of course, under certain guardrails. And so in conclusion, the reasons why you'll find African founders preferring to incorporate in the US is because of its investor-friendly nature. It's because of the transaction efficiency in terms of how fast transactions are able to move from start to finish. It's because of the established legal system that has created a level of predictability in terms of how certain decisions are going to be made. And finally, it's also because of exit readiness. What I mean by this is that having IPOs and exits is easier, typically when you are operating in the US. Now that I've been able to break down why incorporation in the US is important, I think we can be able to come down to Africa, or rather, can be able to consider the reality that we have as Africans. The point of this podcast is to be able to allow you as an African founder to understand the nuances that are going to exist for you, especially from a legal standpoint. We've started with, one, the importance of incorporation. We've trickled down to why incorporation in the US has been favored before and why it might be important for you, depending on your specific dynamics. And now we are going to break it down to what incorporation looks like in the different African countries. Typically, when you're looking at incorporation, the process is essentially the same, where you are required to provide a company name, the details of the shareholders, as well as a constitution of sorts. Depending on the country, it's going to change. Typically, it's referred to as memats, or articles and memorandum of association. When you're looking at the US, it's either going to be bylaws or a board charter, depending on where you're incorporating at. And so when you're looking at the incorporation requirements, is that typically you're going to be asked to choose between some certain names that you'd be interested in as a founder. If they're not available, then, for example, here in Kenya, you're going to provide 5 names in the order of priority, and then they're going to be selected depending on the availability. After that, you're going to provide details on the shareholders of the company, who are going to be making decisions on behalf of the company. And so in that respect, you're going to provide details such as the ID, the passport, the residential address of that person, phone number, email address, basically the things that would allow the government to understand who this individual is. At the same time, you'd also have a constitution that would also guide the company in terms of what it can and cannot do. In the past, for example, in Kenya, we had companies that had restricted memorandums and articles of association. That to mean that if you decided that a company was doing X, for example, making juice, your company could only make juice. In the recent past, we've had companies evolving where they can be able to do any object that they deem fit. This has happened in Kenya specifically after the enactment of the New Companies Act that allows 2 realities to happen that were previously not possible. One is formation of a single shareholder company, and secondly is having the ability to choose what are referred to as model articles. Model articles are a constitution that has generally been provided by the government that allows you as a business owner to operate within any industry without a lot of restrictions. But then if you opt to have your business have restricted parameters in terms of the constitution, in terms of what you can and cannot do, that's also possible. And in fact, you find that there's some companies that are in very, very critical industries that opt to do that. And so that's a reality that has also been reflected in other jurisdictions as well, such as South Africa and Nigeria, where we are seeing governments leaning towards the possibility of having a single shareholder. And so typically that's the process that you're going to have, regardless of whether you're incorporating in Kenya, South Africa, or in Nigeria. And all of them are going to have a similar process in terms of how you're going to do it, where there's a government portal, and the process typically takes either a week or slightly more for you to be able to get your certificate of incorporation and the other things that you might require. At the same time, it's important to note that incorporation is not an isolated process. There are other things that you will need to do in order to ensure that your company can continue operating. What I mean by this, in Kenya, for example, there is a requirement to have an office or a place of business. In tax, it's referred to as a permanent residence, where regardless of whether it's a permanent place of business or it's a residential area, provided you're using it to generate significant income on behalf of a business, then it could be qualified as a taxable income or a permanent residence for that matter. Incorporation is not done in isolation. There are some certain things that you will require to do to maintain your business or for you to have the ability to operate. In some countries, you will find that it's a mandatory requirement to have a place of business where people can come and connect with you and actually determine whether you exist or not, especially when you're operating in certain industries, for example, in fintech. At the same time, you are also going to require a tax identification number. So for you as a company to engage legally, the government is going to require to obtain tax from you. And so one of the critical requirements that you're going to need is a tax identification number, which applies both in Kenya and in South Africa, as well as Nigeria. And so the last critical thing that we need to do on Monday is also establishing a bank account. The reason you are going to require a bank account is that you need to, one, have contractual obligations with certain parties. And as a matter of professional courtesy and in some certain situations, you're not going to be able to engage with them without having a bank account. In fact, some investors are not going to take you seriously without doing the same. And so typically one of the greatest impediments I've seen founders face is that, one, they might want to incorporate in a certain African country, but there's a mandatory requirement to present yourself to the bank, to the branch specifically. And that becomes restrictive, or you find that a founder is required to have a permanent place of business and they can't be able to provide that because they're maybe not living in that country per se. And so these are some of the nuances that you really need to look at and determine before you begin this process, so that you can determine what you need even before you start. And so generally, we are saying that on Monday, there are certain things that you need to do to, one, guarantee that your business is going to be a living entity. And these things are, one, incorporation. And this, we've said that it needs to be done depending on the nature of your business, whether it's local, whether it's regional, or whether it's global. In addition, we've also said that there's certain requirements that are going to be needed in terms of the incorporation process. I'm not going to belabor them. At the same time, we've also said that the second thing that you're going to require for you to become a going concern is a tax identification number. In Kenya, that's referred to as a KRA PIN. And that is essentially going to allow you to operate within the country and have the ability to do some certain transactions. For example, here in Kenya, you might not own some certain classes of property without having a KRA PIN, or you might not be able to access some certain services without having it. And so as a business, this could curtail your progress without putting all these things in mind. And then finally, we said that it's important for you to consider the bank account, and that some of the impediments that I've noticed in the past is, one, lacking the ability to present yourself physically at the bank, or secondly, having a permanent place of business or a residential address that you can provide. And so there are some ways that you can be able to circumvent some of these challenges, but these are the things that you should think of as a founder. In conclusion, just as Solomon had his birth on Monday, as a founder, your birth is going to be crystallized by having incorporation and being a going concern. In Africa, incorporation is not just about paperwork. Incorporation gives you the right to own a name. It gives you the right to belong, and it gives you a heartbeat. Thank you so much for joining us on the first episode of Solomon's Journey, Monday, where we're trying to understand how you become a going concern as a founder. On this episode, we've covered how to do incorporation, both locally, regionally, and globally. At the same time, we've also talked about the importance of obtaining a tax identification number for your business and for the founders. And finally, we've talked about the importance of having a bank account and how it's essential in having commercial agreements as well as contractual obligations. And so in the same way that we were able to have the birth of Simon Makonde on Monday, on Tuesday we're going to be seeking to name him. And in this respect, we're going to seek to protect three things: your people, your ideas, and your property. Tune in on Tuesday. Share this with your founder circle. Can't wait to see you.